Hey guys, tonight we curl up near a prehistoric fire where shadows dance like nervous deer and stories barely have verbs yet. You can hear the soft cracking of damp branches, smell the sharp musk of smoked meat, and feel the warm breath of someone very hairy. Probably your mum telling you why the moon keeps chasing the sun. She's holding a stick and she's drawing something on the dirt floor. A mammoth maybe? Or a god? Or dinner? Hard to tell. Either way, you're in the first recorded sleepover in human history, and you probably won't survive this without a good blanket. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I want to know if you're a 9 PM tea sipper or a 3 AM spiral scroller. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You pull your fur up tighter, nose itching with soot and the occasional flea. Somewhere outside, a wolf howls. Or maybe it's your little sibling who's still teething on a bone. Story time in this Paleolithic cave doesn't involve words as much as noises, gestures, and the occasional interpretive dance. But it works. Because tonight's tale is about why the sun stopped falling out of the sky, and how a giant bird with a snake for a tail saved it by sneezing. You don't question the logic. You're 4 years old. Also, you're probably covered in mud and don't know what logic is. Historians still argue whether early humans had structured myths or were just improvising wildly like toddlers with puppets. But we know that by 40,000 years ago, humans were already painting their stories on cave walls. In places like Lascaux and Chauvet, faded ochre shapes, bison, horses, hunting lines, hint at an ancient habit, explaining the confusing universe just enough to let kids sleep, and maybe keep them from wandering off and petting a saber-toothed cat. You yawn. Across the fire, a child mimics the storyteller's exaggerated gestures, pretending to throw a spear at the moon. It's unclear whether the tale has a moral, but the rhythm of the voice, the lilt of repetition, and the physical closeness of the group cast a calming spell. This isn't just entertainment. This is how memories were made. Long before libraries, bedtime stories were the hard drives of the early culture, passed from mouth to mouth like roasted berries. Quirky fact incoming. Some anthropologists believe early lullabies may have mimicked animal sounds, low hums, coos, and rhythmic grunts, to keep predators at bay. That's right. Your bedtime soothing may have started as a tactical sonic camouflage. Who knew your ancestors were basically whispering, "Please don't eat us," in lullaby format? You shift in your hay pile, or maybe it's a moss bed, or a heap of slightly chewed furs, and watch smoke curl toward the rock ceiling. A handprint there. Someone pressed their palm in pigment and slapped it to the wall. Maybe that was the first recorded "Once upon a time," or the first "I was here" graffiti. Either way, it lingers, and it's not all simple stories. By the time language became more structured, parents weren't just narrating the stars, they were embedding survival wisdom, social rules, and what not to eat if you wanted to keep your kidneys. Don't climb the cliff near the owl's nest becomes a fable about a boy who challenged the wind and got turned into a fish. Honestly, it's more memorable that way, especially if you're 4 and easily distracted by shiny rocks. You rub your eyes, someone's snoring nearby, or inventing jazz. Hard to say. Outside the cave, the wind howls again, but in here, it's warm, rhythmic, secure. The story winds down, maybe with a funny noise, maybe with a carved object passed hand to hand, and as the fire shrinks to embers, you feel the comforting weight of a narrative wrapping you up. Not for logic, not for accuracy, but for the pure magic of believing that the world, in all its danger and weirdness, can make just enough sense to fall asleep. Now the cave dims. You can almost hear the flickering shadows tell their own stories on the wall, silent, shifting, never quite still. No one writes anything down. No one needs to. Because the story has passed from lips to memory, again and again, across generations who couldn't spell story, but knew exactly how it sounded. And if your sleepy brain forgets a few details, like whether the snakebird sneezed before or after the moon got stuck, don't worry. That's part of the deal. Every telling changes it. Every bedtime shapes it. That's how stories stay alive, not in ink, but in your half-conscious brain, seconds before you finally drift off. You blink awake, or maybe you never fully slept. The fire's gone to a faint glow now, the cave cooler, your limbs a bit stiff. But tonight's story time hasn't ended, it's just shifted continents. Because now you're curled up in a reed hut near the Nile listening to your Egyptian mother retell the myth of Isis and Osiris for the 100th time. Her voice is smooth as the river, each line practiced, memorized, almost ritual. She pauses for dramatic effect, eyes narrowing as she whispers how Osiris was chopped into 14 pieces by his jealous brother. Yes, bedtime stories in ancient Egypt didn't shy away from sibling drama. You flinch, but only a little. You already know Isis finds all the body parts and basically reboots her husband like a godly Frankenstein. This is your favourite part. Historians still argue whether these bedtime tales were truly sacred to every family or more like the PG-13 version of religious myths passed down casually at home. But what we do know is that stories like these were so central to Egyptian identity that they got painted on tombs, chanted in rituals, and taught to children as moral compasses. Osiris, after all, wasn't just a dead guy. He was a symbol of rebirth, order, and how not to let your brother throw you into a coffin during a dinner party. Honestly, fair advice. You stretch, the faint scent of lotus in the air. Or maybe that's just the marsh. Outside, a crocodile slips quietly through the reeds, not remotely impressed that your mum just name-dropped Horus like she knows him. But for you, it's thrilling. This world, where gods turn into falcons and the sun rides a boat through the underworld, feels as close as the ceiling fan over your bed. A quirky tidbit. Ancient Egyptian children were often named after gods as a form of protection, sort of like having a mythological superhero on speed dial. Imagine being named Little Anubis, just in case something tried to snatch you during nap time. Your eyes trace the faded mural across the wall, maybe a jackal-headed figure, maybe just bad drawing. Doesn't matter. You remember the beats: betrayal, magic, reunion, justice. These aren't just stories to fill time before sleep, they're instruction manuals for how the world works. Nightly reminders that the chaos of death isn't the end, it's a rerouting. That order returns, that good siblings put you back together, even if you've been hacked into bits. You know, the usual sibling duty. Somewhere outside, a frog croaks. Another child shifts nearby, humming softly. A lullaby passed down from her grandmother, who probably sang it while grain was being weighed in a market stall. You wonder how many of these stories were whispered in homes not unlike yours. How many were made up on the fly because someone refused to sleep without one more God story. You picture your mother now, nodding off mid-Osiris, still rocking gently from the rhythm of her own voice. Her head tilts back. Her necklace, a clay ankh, rattles gently against her chest. She never quite finishes the story tonight. That's okay. You've already memorized it. You could tell it backward if you had to. Not that anyone's asking, but still, it lives inside you. There's a comfort in this, a pattern. You start to realize bedtime storytelling isn't random. It's a ritual. A soft-spoken transfer of power from one mind to the next. And even when it comes wrapped in chaos, like gods fighting in the underworld or sneaky cobras appearing mid-sentence, there's a strange stillness that follows. A trust in the tale, in the teller, in the idea that sleep can wait until justice is restored. The breeze flutters the rushes that make up your wall. You can hear the hush of the Nile, wide, slow, eternal, like a story itself. And it strikes you that maybe bedtime wasn't just for the children. Maybe the parents needed this too. A moment of control, a ritual to center themselves after a long day of dodging hippos and trying to get through taxes carved in stone. A reminder, perhaps, that even when the sun dies each night, it always comes back in the morning, with Ra steering it across the sky like an overworked Uber driver. You settle deeper into your mat. The air hums with small noises, crickets, river water, the occasional creak of papyrus. But your brain, it's narrating, filling in gaps, replaying scenes from the myth with slightly updated choreography. Maybe this time Isis loses a sandal. Maybe Anubis wears sunglasses. That's the thing about oral storytelling. It mutates with your mood. And that's exactly why it survives. Your mum stirs, half waking, to murmur something about Horus avenging his father. She doesn't need to finish the line. You already know. Horus always wins. He always flies. And he always brings back the day. That's enough for tonight. You wake up somewhere colder. Straw pokes into your neck, and you realise you're in a smoky longhouse deep in the Scandinavian woods. Outside, snow sighs quietly against the wooden beams, and someone is roasting fish that may or may not have been dead before it hit the fire. Inside, your Viking father sits by the hearth, absent-mindedly whittling a piece of driftwood into something vaguely weapon-shaped. You, meanwhile, are wrapped in furs that smell faintly of goat and old onions, waiting for tonight's bedtime tale. He begins, not with "once upon a time," but with a grunt and a statement. Odin traded his eye for wisdom. Right off the bat, it's clear we're not in Mother Goose territory. This is the kind of story where sacrifice is noble. Ravens spy for you, and bedtime often involves frost giants. Your father's voice rumbles like distant thunder, telling you how Odin, chief of the Norse gods, hung himself on the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights to unlock the secrets of the runes. Yes, that's your soothing nightcap. Divine self-hanging in exchange for knowledge. Historians still argue whether children in Viking societies actually heard these full, gritty epics before bed, or if they got a lighter, troll-filled version. But you don't care. This is the good stuff. The longhouse creaks as the wind presses against it, trying to sneak in like an unwelcome guest. You pull your furs tighter. Your father is now describing Thor battling the Midgard serpent, and you swear the way his eyebrows twitch matches the storm outside. He's not just telling a story, he's reliving a saga. You're caught between awe and amusement. Somewhere in the back of your mind, you know this tale has been passed down not just by word, but by mead-soaked song and dramatic carvings on boats. Fun side note, Norse children sometimes carried small Thor's hammer pendants to keep evil spirits away. Think of it as a prehistoric nightlight with better marketing. Your dad reaches the part where Loki does something terrible, but charmingly terrible, and you laugh despite yourself. Loki's that cousin who shows up uninvited, breaks everything, then makes you laugh so hard you forget to be mad. You imagine telling this same story someday, maybe editing out the bloodier bits and adding a joke or two about Odin needing a stronger helmet. Firelight flickers across the longhouse beams. You realise these stories weren't just entertainment, they were blueprints for navigating a chaotic world. Vikings weren't exactly dealing with peaceful school runs. They needed stories that said, life is brutal, yes, but also poetic, tragic, but weirdly hilarious, especially if a goat gets involved. Your dad trails off, staring into the fire, possibly remembering a different war, or maybe just trying to recall if he fed the pigs. You feel the weight of the saga settle over you, thick and heavy like a winter pelt. There's something oddly comforting about stories where the end of the world, Ragnarok, is expected, prepared for, even welcomed. You can't quite tell if that's deeply empowering or wildly concerning. Maybe both. The embers hiss. Somewhere, someone snores rhythmically, perfectly in sync with the tale's slow conclusion. You let yourself drift a little, not quite asleep, not quite listening, just floating in that fuzzy space where Thor is real, Jörmungandr circles the earth, and bedtime lasts as long as the mead does. And just as your eyelids begin to droop, your father mutters one final line about Valhalla, where brave warriors feast forever. It's supposed to be heroic, but to your exhausted brain, it mostly sounds like unlimited dinner rolls. You smile. That's the Viking version of a lullaby. You blink, and the longhouse becomes a smoky cave. You're somewhere much older now, somewhere where words haven't quite figured out how to wear their proper clothes yet. Your bed is a pile of fur and leaves. Your room is a shallow depression in a cave wall, and your parents are, well, not quite parents as you know them. but they have eyes full of firelight and voices like the scrape of stone on stone, and they too tell stories. They don't have bedtime books or candlelit scrolls. What they do have are walls, vast cool cave walls just begging to be painted. So that's how stories begin here. Not spoken, but smeared, dotted, traced in ochre and ash. Tonight's tale starts with a figure drawn on stone, a man with limbs like wind and a head shaped like a deer's. The old ones call him the Horned Spirit. You naturally just think he looks like someone who's been in quarantine too long. Your mother hums softly as she adds dots around the figure's feet, perhaps representing a ritual dance, or, according to some fringe theories, the very first version of a bedtime conga line. Historians still argue whether cave paintings were stories told to children, visual spiritual guides, or just bored doodles by early art kids who didn't yet have sketchbooks. She begins the story in sounds more than words, growls, clicks, a sweeping arm that mimics the rush of buffalo herds. Your father jumps in, miming the chase with enthusiastic, possibly exaggerated, whooping. Suddenly you're wide awake, caught in the middle of a tale told with lungs and limbs instead of adjectives and metaphors. There's no plot twist, unless you count "then a giant bear came out of nowhere" as a twist. One mainstream fact here: the Chauvet Cave in France holds some of the oldest known cave art, dating back over 30,000 years. These prehistoric murals suggest that storytelling, even then, wasn't just about passing time. It was about preserving the soul of a moment, the thrill of the hunt, the memory of a moonlit escape. And probably, yes, a little bit of trying to scare the kids into not wandering out of the cave at night. Your mother traces a red smear that loops around a herd of painted animals. "The Great One," she says, or rather she gestures, the meaning as much in her eyes as in her mouth. This creature, you realise, isn't meant to be feared. It's a protector. A beast so ancient and wise that even the stars pause when it walks. Or maybe she just made that part up tonight. Who knows? That's the thing about stories without scripts. You curl tighter into the furs. The fire crackles, pushing back the dark. The air smells like ash, moss, and roasted root vegetables. Your parents' silhouettes dance against the cave wall, larger-than-life shadow puppets retelling a tale they might not fully understand but feel in their bones. There's a rhythm to the performance, an almost musical repetition of movements and sounds. It lulls you, even as you try to figure out whether the painted snake on the wall was just for show or an ancient version of bedtime foreshadowing. You're guessing foreshadowing. With snakes, it's always foreshadowing. Then comes a moment of calm. The story winds down. The Horned Spirit retreats. The buffalo vanish into a swirl of pigment. And your mother, now sitting beside you, hums again. It's not quite a lullaby. More like a bedtime spell cast with breath instead of magic. You start to fade, imagining the night air thick with spirits, the cave holding its breath until dawn. And yet, even as your eyes close, you sense this story isn't just for tonight. It will stay painted on the wall long after your bones become dust. It's a bedtime story with a half-life, a myth that endures because it's etched into stone and skin and memory. Modern joke. There's no denying that these early bedtime stories were hardcore. No princesses, no glass slippers, just a whole lot of wild animals, mysterious horned creatures, and moral lessons like don't poke the mammoth. But hey, it worked. You're still here, right? Some scholars argue whether these stories even had children in mind at all, or whether bedtime as a concept even existed in an era where sleeping when you weren't freezing or being eaten was already a win. But still, here in this moment, nestled into your fur pile, with your parents reenacting a thunderstorm using only their hands and 2 rocks, it feels like a bedtime story to you. And that's enough. You wake up somewhere completely different. The furs are gone, the cave walls are replaced by neatly arranged bricks, and the air smells faintly of olive oil and dust. You're in ancient Mesopotamia now, nestled in a modest home in Ur or maybe Babylon. The sky outside is bruised with twilight, and someone's mother is lighting a clay lamp, the flame flickering like it's trying to tell a story of its own. Tonight's tale doesn't start with painted walls or mimed hunts. It starts with a tablet. Not the kind with Wi-Fi and low battery anxiety, but a chunky rectangle of clay, freshly pressed with cuneiform. It's still slightly damp, like a historical brownie. Your father squints at the markings, lips moving silently, as if he's decoding a message from the gods, or from his mother-in-law, which honestly feels just as risky. He begins to recite. Not act, not hum, not gesture wildly, just read. The story is long, winding, and dense. The Epic of Gilgamesh, perhaps, the oldest surviving written tale in human history. A story about grief, gods, friendship, and some weird snake business. You try to follow along, but the pace is glacial. Like, you could have built a ziggurat in the time it takes Gilgamesh to process one emotion slow. Still, there's something soothing in the cadence, in the way the syllables stretch across the room like shadow puppets. You lay back and stare at the ceiling, which is just straw and sticks, listening to your father's voice glide between verses like it's been doing this for centuries. One mainstream historical fact: Mesopotamian parents did indeed tell tales from long epics like Gilgamesh, and children learned morals, myths, and the dangers of hubris through them. The stories were part bedtime ritual, part oral schooling, and part flex. After all, it takes serious lung power to make it through 12 stone tablets without losing your place. Tonight's bedtime moment comes when Gilgamesh confronts his mortality. Your father's voice softens, lingering on the phrase about Enkidu's death. You feel something tighten in your chest. It's not the most exciting part of the story, but it hits in a way that silence doesn't. It's as if, thousands of years ago, some Sumerian parent hoped their child might sleep more soundly knowing even demigods cry. Historians still argue whether these stories were truly told to lull children to sleep, or if they were more like state-sponsored morality plays for future scribes. But evidence suggests both parents and temple educators use such tales to shape not just dreams, but behaviour. Clean your hands, listen to your elders, don't fight bulls without a permit, that sort of thing. And then comes the quirky part. Your mother chimes in, not to correct the story, but to add her favourite bit. A tiny, mostly forgotten fragment, where a temple priest warns Gilgamesh that drinking too much beer will make him slow and foolish. You laugh. Some bedtime stories age like wine, others age like lukewarm beer. You're not sure if you're supposed to sleep now or reflect deeply on human frailty. It's honestly a toss-up. You pull the blanket higher, listening to the scraping sound of your father setting the tablet down on a shelf. The clay clicks against stone, a sound so small yet heavy with centuries. The room dims, the lamp flickers again. The silence after the story isn't awkward, it's thick, intentional. A kind of reverence hangs in the air, like everyone's waiting to see if Gilgamesh will walk through the door and say, "Hey, anyone else here questioning the meaning of life?" Your eyes close, but the images don't fade. You dream of rivers that flood without warning, cities built from mud and miracle, and gods with temper issues. You're still a child, but your dreams now carry the weight of empires. And then, somewhere in the space between sleep and thought, you wonder, did the story end, or did it just rest, waiting to be picked up again tomorrow night? It's a bedtime ritual older than bedtime, one that passes not just down a family line, but across civilizations. A quiet, sleepy rebellion against the chaos of the waking world. One last thought before you drift. Remember when bedtime stories were about falling asleep, not grappling with existential dread caused by ancient kings who build walls to keep out time itself? Fun stuff. You blink, and the city of evaporates like steam. Suddenly, everything smells like camphor and incense, and the room around you is carved from stone so smooth it feels like water turned solid. A breeze flutters a curtain, and it smells of jasmine, heat, and the faint trace of sandalwood. You're in ancient India now. Maybe Varanasi, maybe somewhere along the Ganges. Outside, night birds trill, and the stars are lined up like they're about to chant mantras. Here, bedtime isn't just a parental duty, it's part of Dharma, a gentle offering. You lie on a thin mat beside a small oil lamp, and your grandmother adjusts your blanket with the precision of someone who has done this 1,000 nights before. She begins not with a plot, but a chant. Rhythmic syllables that taste like cardamom and driftwood, half lullaby, half invocation. She's telling the story of the Panchatantra. You know the characters, the clever jackal, the foolish lion, the scheming crow. Animal stories, fables really, but layered so deeply in political wisdom and human foibles that you suspect they were written by someone who survived multiple palace coups and still managed to laugh about it. Tonight's fable, The Monkey and the Crocodile. You've heard it before, but like all good bedtime tales, it improves with repetition, like reheated chai that somehow tastes better than fresh. A monkey and a crocodile become friends. The crocodile's wife wants to eat the monkey's heart. Things escalate. You grin. Classic toxic relationship. Your grandmother's voice flows smoothly between dialogue and moral. Never trust flattery from those with slippery motives, she says, winking like she knows your classmates have been talking behind your back. Mainstream historical fact. Easy. Stories from the Panchatantra were designed to teach wisdom to princes. They were bedtime tales with political edge, whispered to prepare children not just for sleep, but for rule. The quirk? These tales were so popular they hopped continents like sleepy fleas. Versions of the Panchatantra appear in Persian, Arabic, even European medieval collections. Your monkey and crocodile are world travellers, jet-lagged probably. You nestle deeper, listening as the story winds down. She finishes, and you expect silence. But no. Tonight's twist is a riddle. She hums a little tune, then asks, "What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 at noon, and 3 in the evening?" You roll your eyes. You know this one. It's the riddle of the Sphinx, technically Greek. But grandmothers have a way of collecting content like ancient influencers. Historians still argue whether the Panchatantra's real purpose was moral training or political manipulation. Were children being entertained, or groomed for survival in a brutal court system, where the wrong eye contact meant exile or worse? The jury's still napping on that one. And then there's the ritual of it all. After the story comes the thread. Your grandmother ties a thin piece of red thread around your wrist, murmuring something about protection from nightmares. You're not sure if it's magic or just symbolic, but either way, it feels better than your current plan, which was to hide under the blanket if a demon showed up. You drift off with the image of a monkey outwitting a crocodile by pure wit alone. You wonder, do grown-ups really believe in these stories? Or do they tell them because they want to believe children will be smarter, wiser, better prepared? Maybe that's the real bedtime spell. Not the story, but the hope baked into every twist. Somewhere between dream and dawn, the crocodile smiles in your mind, and you hear your grandmother's voice. Always keep your heart where others can't steal it. You smile in your sleep. Not bad advice. You wake again, this time to the sound of footsteps tapping on wooden floors and a faint scent of ink and parchment. The world has shifted. You're in medieval Europe. The flicker of candlelight casting shadows on stone walls, with tapestries hanging just out of reach. The evening chill seeps through a drafty window, but you're bundled up in a wool blanket, safe for the moment. Tonight's storytelling happens by the hearth, where your mother, dressed in a simple woolen gown, holds a thick, leather-bound book. It's a luxury. Books are rare and precious in this time, often chained to the shelf. This one is an illuminated manuscript filled with gold leaf and illustrations so detailed you swear the knight's armour might clink if you touch the page. She opens it and begins to read from a medieval bestiary, a favourite bedtime choice for children of the era. You listen as she describes animals real and fantastical, lions that breathe fire, unicorns with healing powers, and dragons that guard treasure, and sometimes entire kingdoms. But these aren't just fairy tales. Each creature carries a lesson. The lion represents courage, the unicorn purity, the dragon danger lurking in the unknown. One mainstream historical fact: bestiaries were among the most popular medieval books, used not only for entertainment but as moral guides. They were the bedtime stories before bedtime stories were a thing. Parents used these tales to impart virtues and warn against vices, often through allegory. But here's a quirky detail. Some bestiaries included the barnacle goose myth, a bird said to grow from driftwood and barnacles, which medieval folks believed explained how geese appeared without nesting. So, if you ever wondered why a goose seemed to drop from the sky, blame ancient natural history. Your mother's voice softens as she recounts the story of the phoenix, a bird that dies in flames only to be reborn from its ashes. You imagine the glowing feathers, and the warmth from the hearth suddenly feels like a personal invitation to dream of renewal. It's a comforting bedtime metaphor that has outlived even the medieval manuscript itself. Historians still argue whether these stories were primarily religious tools or simply entertainment for children and adults alike. Some scholars believe bestiaries were coded lessons on how to behave in a rigidly hierarchical society, while others think they were the medieval equivalent of fantasy novels, escapism with a sprinkle of morality. You nod off as your mother closes the book, but not before whispering a final thought. Remember, even the mightiest fall, but some rise again. It sounds like advice meant for kings, but also for children learning to face their own fears. Your dreams that night swirl with dragons, knights, and barnacle geese. Somehow, you know the stories will wait for you tomorrow, ready to teach, to soothe, and to carry you gently back to sleep. You stir again, this time to a faint crackle of firelight and a breeze carrying the smell of dried herbs and fresh bread. You're somewhere warmer, perhaps a humble village in colonial America or a cottage somewhere in England. The walls are timber, and the wooden floor creaks underfoot as if it's trying to keep a secret. Bedtime stories here aren't from grand books or sacred scrolls, they come from memory and experience. Your parents sit beside you, rocking gently in an old wooden chair, and their voice is steady, a little gravelly from years of work and laughter. Tonight they're sharing folk tales, those timeless oral legends passed down through generations, stitched together with history and imagination. You listen to the tale of John Henry, the steel-driving man, who raced a steam-powered hammer and won only to die with his hammer in hand. It's a story that feels raw and honest, about strength, determination, and the price of progress. You almost smell the coal dust, feel the sweat and grit. Here's your mainstream fact. Folktales like John Henry's originated as oral traditions, especially among working-class and marginalised communities who didn't have access to printed books. These stories were survival tools teaching values and histories when literacy was rare. But here's a quirky tidbit. Some versions of John Henry say he was a giant, over 9 feet tall, while others claim he was just an average man with a heart twice as big. Folklore tends to stretch the truth like a well-worn blanket, making heroes larger than life, and sometimes literally so. Your parent chuckles softly before launching into a ghost story, a New England tale about the Grey Man, a spectral figure said to warn shipwrecked sailors of impending storms. The story is part warning, part comfort, the kind of tale that makes you clutch the blanket but also look for signs of protection. Historians still argue whether such folk stories originated purely as entertainment or whether they served as coded warnings and instructions, especially in dangerous environments like the sea or frontier life. Some say ghost stories were early forms of community psychology, helping people cope with the unknown. You feel the night deepen as the stories turn quieter, less about hammering steel and more about whispered warnings. Your parents' voice is softer now, almost a murmur, as you drift towards sleep, tangled in the stories of strength, spirit, and survival. You realise these stories aren't just for bedtime. They're a bridge between past and future, a way to carry the wisdom of those who came before you, and maybe, just maybe, a promise that you too will be remembered. The air shifts again. Now you're under a vast starry sky, the scent of sagebrush and pine thick in the cool night air. You lie on a woven blanket, the ground firm beneath you, and hear the crackling of a campfire. Your parents' voice, rich and steady, rises and falls like the wind weaving through the trees. Tonight's stories come from the oral traditions of indigenous peoples of North America, stories not just told for amusement, but sacred, tied to land, spirit, and survival. You hear about Coyote, the trickster, whose antics explain the world's oddities and teach important lessons in humility, respect, and balance. A mainstream historical fact: many indigenous stories have been orally transmitted for thousands of years, long before European settlers arrived. These tales shaped cultural identity and connection to nature, often linked to ceremonies and the changing seasons. Here's the quirky bit. In some tribes, storytellers perform using masks and puppetry, making bedtime stories into full-on immersive experiences, more like theatre than simple narration. Imagine a parent putting on a mask of a coyote and suddenly transforming your bedroom into a forest clearing. Talk about bedtime drama. Your parent tells you the story of how the raven stole the sun, a classic tale explaining the origin of daylight, filled with cunning and mischief. The raven's shadow flickers across your mind, a symbol both of creation and chaos. Historians still argue whether these stories should be read purely as myth, historical record, or even ecological guidebooks. Some scholars believe the oral traditions encode environmental knowledge crucial for survival, while others focus on their spiritual and moral dimensions. As the fire's glow dims, your parent's voice softens, reminding you that stories are more than just tales. They are a living conversation between you and the earth, a way to remember who you are and where you come from. You close your eyes, the coyote's laughter echoing gently, feeling strangely comforted by the idea that even tricksters have a role to play in the grand story of life. You wake in a different place again. Now the air feels thick with incense and the faint sound of chanting drifts in from a distant temple. The walls around you are painted with swirling patterns, and golden statues catch what little light there is. Your parents' voice here is calm and deliberate, echoing the rhythm of ancient rituals. Tonight's stories are from ancient India, where bedtime tales aren't just for children. They're sacred texts, blending myth, morality, and philosophy. Your parent begins to recount the famous tales from the Panchatantra, a collection of animal fables that teach wise governance, friendship, and cleverness. A mainstream historical fact. The Panchatantra dates back to around 200 BCE and has been translated into dozens of languages, influencing storytelling worldwide, including the famous Aesop's fables in the West. It's basically the original bedtime storybook. Here's a quirky detail. Some of the stories include talking animals who engage in political intrigue. Imagine a fox plotting against a lion with the subtlety of a medieval courtier. It's like Game of Thrones, but with way fewer dragons and more squirrels. Your parent recounts the story of the clever jackal, who outwits a cruel king to save the animal kingdom. A tale that feels surprisingly modern in its lessons about justice and cunning. You picture the jackal's sly grin, and the flicker of candlelight seems to spotlight its cleverness. Historians still argue whether the Panchatantra was primarily a tool to educate princes in statecraft, or simply a collection of entertaining tales. Some see it as ancient self-help, others as political propaganda cleverly disguised as children's stories. As your parent's voice lowers to a whisper, the stories weave their way into your dreams, talking animals plotting, kings scheming, and the timeless dance of wisdom and folly. You realise these stories carry weight beyond bedtime. They are a blueprint for human behaviour, passed down like a secret code in the night. You drift off, comforted by the idea that the bedtime stories you hear are part of a vast ancient conversation across cultures and centuries. The scene shifts again. Now you're in a cosy, dimly lit room somewhere in medieval Europe, perhaps in a stone-walled cottage or a small manor. The smell of burning tallow and aged wood fills the air. Your parents' voice settles into a steady rhythm as they weave tales that have survived centuries of scribes and storytellers. These bedtime stories are drawn from medieval romances and fairy tales, where knights quest for honour and dragons lurk in dark forests. You hear about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, their chivalry and quests mixing history and legend. A mainstream fact, the Arthurian legends first appeared in written form around the 12th century, though they likely grew from earlier oral tales told across Britain and France. These stories helped shape the ideals of chivalry and courtly love for generations. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some scholars suggest that the Round Table was inspired by actual medieval banquets designed to promote equality among knights, though others argue it's purely symbolic. So was King Arthur a real king or just a medieval PR stunt? Historians still argue. Your parent recounts the story of the brave knight who rescues a princess from a fire-breathing dragon, but the princess surprises everyone by outwitting the dragon herself. It's a tale that flips the script, giving you a subtle nod to changing roles even back then. Bedtime here wasn't just about fantasy, it was about teaching courage, loyalty, and the complicated dance between duty and personal desire. Stories were often told by travelling minstrels or local storytellers, spreading these ideals far beyond castles. There's even a legend that medieval parents would use storytelling to gently scare children into behaving, with tales of witches, goblins, or the mysterious boogeyman, a practice that seems oddly familiar to modern parents. You feel yourself sinking into the warm comfort of the flickering firelight and the rich history woven through the stories. Proof that even in the Middle Ages, bedtime wasn't just about sleep, but about planting dreams. Now you find yourself in a bustling city somewhere in 19th century Europe. Gas lamps cast an amber glow on cobblestone streets slick with rain. The faint sound of horse-drawn carriages and distant laughter hums through the night. Your parents' voice carries a mix of warmth and wonder as they dive into the golden age of printed bedtime stories. This era brought books like the Brothers Grimm fairy tales, collections of dark, twisted folklore gathered and polished for children. The stories had teeth, wolves prowling, witches scheming, and siblings lost in forests, but also hope and magic. Here's a mainstream historical fact. The Brothers Grimm published their first collection in 1812, transforming oral tales into literary staples. Their work influenced storytelling worldwide and helped preserve folklore that might otherwise have vanished. But here's a quirky tidbit. The original Grimm tales were way more gruesome than the sanitized versions you might know. One story involves a witch baking children into pies. You're welcome to skip dessert tonight. Your parent reads you the tale of Hansel and Gretel, but with a twist. The children use clever traps and resourcefulness rather than just running away. It's a story that quietly champions resilience and wit over brute strength. Historians still argue whether the Grimm's work was aimed more at preserving culture or shaping moral lessons for children of the burgeoning middle class. Some see it as political commentary wrapped in fairy tales. You hear your parents' voice soften as they describe the Victorian obsession with bedtime routines and moral instruction. Stories became a tool for teaching obedience and virtue, with strict do's and don'ts woven between the fantasy. Yet, beneath the surface, these tales also allowed children to explore fears and hopes safely, making bedtime a complex blend of caution and comfort. You settle deeper into the cosy chair, warmed by the glow of history, feeling the long shadow these stories have cast across centuries, and realizing your bedtime stories are part of that grand tradition. You drift again, landing this time in a quiet living room in the mid-20th century. The smell of worn books and warm cocoa fills the air, while the soft hum of a radio plays a distant news bulletin. Your parents' voice is familiar, gentle, part soothing storyteller, part world-weary guide. This is the era when bedtime stories began to embrace new media, radio plays, early television, and paperback books designed specifically for children's bedtime. The stories started to balance the comfort of tradition with the excitement of modern life. A mainstream historical fact, the rise of children's television in the 1950s, with shows like Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, changed how stories were told, combining visuals with narration to create immersive bedtime experiences. A quirky bit. Some parents in this period relied on record players to play bedtime stories. Think of it as the Spotify of the 50s. You could fall asleep to a vinyl spinning tales of adventure, no parent required. Your parent tells you about Goodnight Moon, a quintessential bedtime book published in 1947. Its simple, rhythmic text and gentle illustrations turned it into a soothing ritual for millions of children, redefining what bedtime storytelling could be. Historians still argue whether this new media helped deepen children's imagination or made them passive consumers of stories. Did the shift to recorded tales dilute the intimacy of the parent-child storytelling bond? The story shifts to your parent recalling their own childhood bedtime memories, filled with radio fairy tales and book readings, creating a bridge between past and present, old and new. You feel the soft nostalgia as your parent's voice wraps around you, reminding you that stories evolve but their purpose remains the same: to comfort, to teach, and to linger long after the lights go out. The world around you blurs again, now settling into the glow of a modern bedroom. Soft LED lights pulse faintly in the background, and your parents' voice is calm, tech-savvy but still warm and familiar. In the digital age, bedtime stories have transformed once more. Apps, audiobooks, and interactive ebooks have become the new storytelling playgrounds. Your parent talks about how screens and gadgets now share space with the traditional bedtime storybook, sometimes complicating the ritual, but also opening new doors. Here's a mainstream fact. By the early 21st century, digital storytelling platforms were gaining popularity, offering personalized stories, voices, and even choices, making children active participants rather than passive listeners. A quirky detail, some apps even include sleep timers that dim lights or play white noise after the story ends, basically turning your phone into a futuristic lullaby machine. Historians still argue whether technology enhances or disrupts the parent-child storytelling bond. Does swiping and tapping help kids engage more, or does it pull them away from the shared intimacy of a parent's voice? Your parent recounts the story of a popular modern fairy tale app, where children can choose their hero's path, sometimes brave, sometimes mischievous, turning bedtime into a small adventure of autonomy and imagination. Yet, the timeless truth remains. No screen can replace the warmth of a parent's voice, the rhythm of shared breathing, the unspoken comfort that fills the space between words. You feel the gentle tug of both worlds, the familiar softness of human storytelling and the electric pulse of innovation, both weaving into your dreams tonight. As you drift further into the quiet night, your parent's voice slows, softening into a whisper that feels like a gentle breeze. The world around you fades into a gentle haze, the familiar shapes of your bedroom melting into the comforting past of all the bedtime stories you've ever known. You realize how storytelling is more than just words. It's a bridge through time, connecting you to parents long gone and those still beside you. These stories, told and retold, have survived through flickering fires, gas lamps, radio waves, and glowing screens. A mainstream fact: oral storytelling is one of humanity's oldest traditions, predating writing itself by tens of thousands of years, a primal thread weaving through all cultures. Here's a quirky thought. Some researchers suggest that the bedtime story ritual may even shape our brain's ability to dream and imagine, acting as a nightly rehearsal for creativity and empathy. Historians still argue whether the stories told were shaped more by cultural needs or by parents' own fears and hopes for their children. Either way, these tales carry pieces of the past, stitched carefully into your dreams. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You feel the soothing cadence of your parents' voice drift away, a lullaby of history and heart, inviting you to rest peacefully, cradled by the stories that will stay long after bedtime. The night deepens gently around you, softening the edges of the day. Each word you've heard becomes a whisper carried on a slow breeze, brushing past your thoughts and settling softly in your mind. The warmth of a parent's voice, centuries old yet always new, wraps around you like a familiar blanket, comforting and steady. You breathe slowly, feeling the quiet pulse of stories that travel beyond time, lingering just at the edge of sleep. Let your imagination drift freely now, carried on the gentle waves of ancient tales and modern whispers alike. Rest easy, knowing these stories are not just words but connections, threads weaving through history, love and memory. They hold you safe as you slip into dreams, cradled by the past and glowing softly in the dark. Good night, sweet dreams.